The woman in the black dress didn't walk into Murphy's saloon. She materialized. One moment the door was shut against the dust and the dying light. The next she was standing there, a silhouette carved from vengeance and nightfall. Every laugh died in a throat. Every clink of a glass froze midair. The piano player's fingers stiffened over the keys, leaving a single sour note hanging in the sudden, tomb-like silence. She wasn't just a stranger. She was an omen. Her fingers, gloved in black leather, traced the brim of her hat, shadowing a face nobody in the room could say they recognized. But every man there felt like they should have. A cold dread, ancient and familiar, slithered up their spines. Her eyes, dark and patient, scanned the room of slack-jawed drinkers, passing over each one like a judge weighing souls. And then they stopped. They found him. Thomas Razor Murphy, slumped in his usual corner table, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. He'd gotten fat in the 5 years since he'd made his name. Fat and comfortable and loud. He was the town's boogeyman, the man who'd single-handedly driven out the troublesome Thorne family and burned their ranch to the ground. He loved telling the story, loved the way men looked at him with a mix of fear and admiration. Tonight, he was deep in that very tale, his voice slurring as he bragged about the smell of burning pine and the screams he swore he never heard. He was so lost in his own legend that he didn't notice the silence. He didn't notice the shadow that had fallen over his table until it spoke. "You've been telling that story for a long time, Thomas." The voice was soft, softer than silk, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Murphy looked up, his face a mask of drunken annoyance. He saw a woman, cloaked in black, sitting in the chair opposite him, a chair that had been empty a second ago. He was sure of it. The kerosene lamp between them flickered, casting shadows that danced across her face, making it look like a death mask carved from stone. He opened his mouth to tell her to get lost, to curse her for interrupting the best part of his story. But the words never came. Something in her gaze, a stillness that felt older than the mountains, held him in place. "You don't remember me, do you, Thomas?" she asked, her voice a low whisper that only he could hear. A smile touched her lips, but it was the kind of smile you'd find on a skull in a graveyard. It held no warmth, only the promise of a cold, dark end. He squinted, his whiskey-soaked brain struggling to place her. The face was wrong, too sharp, too pale. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. He'd seen them before, in a fire. She reached into her coat, her movements slow, deliberate. He instinctively flinched, his hand twitching toward the pistol tucked into his belt. But she wasn't reaching for a gun. She placed a small object on the worn wood of the table. It was a piece of charred timber, no bigger than his palm. Burned into its surface, faint but unmistakable, was a single letter. T, the last remnant of the Thorne Ranch sign. Murphy's face, already flushed with booze, went white as a fresh snow. The saloon, the noise, the world, it all dissolved into a roaring in his ears. His big, clumsy fingers trembled as they reached for his gun, but he stopped. He stopped because he realized she still wasn't reaching for hers. She was just watching him with the infinite patience of a predator that knows its prey is already caught. "Cordelia," he whispered, the name tasting like ash and terror in his mouth. Cordelia Thorne died in that fire. His own voice sounded alien to him, thin and cracked like a frightened boy's. "Everyone knows that." The woman leaned forward, the lamplight catching a network of faint, silvery lines that traced their way up her left cheek. Scars. Burn scars. "Everyone knows a lot of things that aren't true," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Like how you told the whole town my husband Samuel started that fire himself, trying to fake his own death to escape gambling debts. How you convinced them we were harboring fugitives. How you made sure no one ever looked too close." Each word was a nail hammered into his coffin. Murphy's chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he shoved himself back from the table. He had to get out. He had to run. But her hand shot across the table, impossibly fast, and gripped his wrist. It wasn't the strength of her grip that made him cry out. It was the texture. Through the thin leather of her glove, He could feel the rigid, uneven terrain of scar tissue, the hand of a ghost who had clawed her way out of the grave. "I've been thinking about you, Thomas," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Every single day, for 1,825 days. Wondering if you ever wake up screaming? Wondering if you ever hear Samuel's voice when the thunder rolls?" She paused, tilting her head as if listening to a distant memory. "I do." But what Thomas Murphy didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this conversation was already over. The real checkmate had happened 20 minutes before he'd even walked into the saloon. His fate had been sealed with his first glass of whiskey. Murphy tried to stand, to rip his arm away, but his legs felt like they were made of wet sand. A strange numbness was spreading up from his boots, a cold, creeping paralysis. His vision started to swim, the edges of the room blurring into a dark, swirling vortex. He tried to call for help, to warn the others, but his tongue was a leaden weight in his mouth. He stumbled sideways, his chair clattering to the floor. The entire saloon, which had been watching in rapt silence, now gasped as one. "Easy there, Thomas," Cordelia said, her voice suddenly loud and clear, full of false concern. She stood and caught his arm, her grip like an iron manacle. "Looks like you've had a little too much tonight." To the stunned onlookers, she was a good Samaritan, a kind woman helping a pathetic drunk who couldn't hold his liquor. Murphy tried to scream, to tell them, "She poisoned me," but all that came out was a low, guttural groan. His body was a prison, and his mind was the only frantic inmate left rattling the bars. Cordelia half-dragged, half-guided him toward the saloon's back door, nodding politely to the wide-eyed bartender. "I'll see that he gets home safe," she called out, her voice ringing with feigned charity. "Poor man has been pushing himself too hard." The moment the door swung shut behind them, plunging them into the filth-strewn darkness of the alley, her gentle smile evaporated. She shoved him, hard. Murphy crashed against the cold brick wall, his legs giving out completely. He slid down into the mud and grime, a helpless, broken doll. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound, it was almost silent. He could see everything, hear everything, but he couldn't move a single muscle. Cordelia crouched down in front of him, her face now a mask of cold fury in the dim moonlight. "Jimson weed," she said, her voice flat and clinical. "I learned about it from a Comanche woman, the one who found me by the river after you and your friends left me for dead. She said her people call it devil's snare. Funny, isn't it? The very people you called savages know more about medicine and chemistry than a so-called civilized man like you." She pulled a small, worn leather journal from an inside pocket of her dress, flipping it open to a page marked with a black silk ribbon. At the top of the page, in neat, precise script, was his name, Thomas Razor Murphy. Below it were pages of notes, his daily routine, his favorite whiskey, his gambling debts, a list of every crime he'd ever bragged about in a drunken stupor, a list of every man he'd ever killed. "This is going to take about 2 hours to work its way through you, Thomas," she explained, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "2 hours where you can hear and see and feel everything, but you can't move, can't speak, can't even scream for help." She turned the page, showing him a list of 3 names: Thomas Razor Murphy, Silas Kane, Dutch Hartwell. A neat, confident line was already drawn straight through his name. Murphy's eyes rolled frantically in their sockets. He was trapped inside his own body, a spectator to his own execution. She began to read from the journal, her voice a relentless, damning monotone. She read about how he'd spent the money he'd been paid to murder Samuel Thorne, how he'd bought whiskey for the whole town, turning his atrocity into a campfire story, a running joke. "But the best part is, Thomas," she whispered, leaning in so close he could smell the faint scent of smoke that still clung to her, "you're going to be conscious for all of it. You'll feel every single thing that's about to happen to you, just like Samuel felt every single flame." She closed the journal, the snap of the leather cover echoing like a gunshot in the silent alley. She stood, brushing the dirt from her black dress, a silhouette of perfect, calculated vengeance. She turned to leave him there, helpless in the dark. But just as she took a step toward the street, a sound sliced through the night air, a sound that made her blood, which had been running hot with victory, turned to ice. A sharp, distinctive whistle. A signal. It was the signal Sheriff Silas Kane always used to call his deputies. And it was coming from the end of the alley. He was close, and he wasn't alone. Cordelia didn't hesitate. Her hand disappeared into the folds of her dress, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar hilt of a Bowie knife. She melted back into the deeper shadows just as Sheriff Kane and two of his deputies rounded the corner, their lanterns cutting yellow swaths through the darkness. Kane had not aged well. The 5 years of guilt and easy living had turned his hair a streaky gray and hung a pouch of a gut over his gun belt. But his eyes were the same cold, calculating blue that had watched her home burn to the ground without lifting a single finger. "Well now," Kane drawled, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol as his lantern light fell on Murphy's paralyzed form. "Heard there was a commotion, a strange woman helping a drunk man home. That's mighty Christian of you, ma'am." Cordelia stepped out of the shadows, carefully keeping her hands in plain sight. Her face was a perfect mask of innocence and concern. "Sheriff, thank heavens," she said, her voice pitched with just the right amount of distress. "This poor man, he just collapsed, right outside the saloon. I was just trying to get him some air." Kane's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, raising his lantern to get a better look at her face. There was something about her voice, a ghost of a memory that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He couldn't place it, but it felt like a nightmare he was struggling to forget. "Funny thing about Good Samaritans," he said, his voice a low growl. "Most of them don't dress for a funeral." Her reply came back instantly, laced with ice. "Maybe that's because some of us recognize death when we see it coming, Sheriff." And in that moment, Kane knew. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. That voice, that cadence, it couldn't be. It was the voice of a ghost, the voice of a woman who was supposed to be nothing but ash and bone buried under 5 years of dirt and lies. His hand clawed for his gun, but Cordelia was faster. The knife was a blur of silver in the lantern light. It flew from her hand with inhuman speed, a silent, spinning bird of death. Before the first deputy could even register the threat, the blade buried itself to the hilt in his throat. He made a wet, gurgling sound and collapsed, his lantern crashing to the cobblestones and extinguishing, plunging one side of the alley into darkness. The second deputy, a young kid barely old enough to shave, yelped in terror and fumbled for his own weapon. "No, you fool!" Kane bellowed, his own gun finally clearing its holster. "Alive! We need her alive!" But the young deputy was panicked. He fired a wild shot into the shadows where Cordelia had been standing just a heartbeat before. The bullet ricocheted off the brick wall with a high-pitched whine. She was gone. She had vanished into the darkness like smoke. The alley was a maze of wooden crates, overflowing trash barrels and deep, impenetrable shadows. And she was a part of it now. Kane could hear her, a faint rustle of cloth, the whisper of a boot on gravel. He could smell her, the faint, haunting scent of wood smoke that seemed to follow her like a curse. The surviving deputy was spinning in circles, his gun shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "Where'd she go, Sheriff? Where is she?" "Cordelia Thorne!" Kane roared into the darkness, his voice tight with a fear he hadn't felt in years. "I should have made damn sure you burned with the rest of it." Her laughter echoed off the brick walls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chilling, ethereal sound that wasn't entirely human. "Oh, you did burn me, Silas." Her voice drifted from behind a stack of rain barrels. "You burned me completely. What you're looking at now is something else. Something you and Dutch Hartwell created." A bottle suddenly smashed against the wall right next to Kane's head. He flinched instinctively, and in that split second of distraction, she exploded from the darkness. She wasn't aiming for him. She tackled the young deputy, driving her shoulder into his chest. They went down in a heap, a tangle of limbs and desperation on the slick cobblestones. Kane recovered, leveling his pistol. He had a clear shot. He could end this right now, put the ghost back in her grave for good. He squeezed the trigger. But what Sheriff Kane didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see, was the man watching from a second-story window across the street. The richest man in town. Dutch Hartwell. And he had just recognized the woman wrestling with his sheriff's deputy. The fine crystal glass of brandy slipped from Dutch Hartwell's fingers, shattering on the polished oak floor of his office. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing the death of the carefully constructed world he had built for himself over the last 5 years. From his window, he had a perfect, horrifying view of the alley below. He saw the woman in black, the woman who had haunted his every waking moment and stalked his dreams. Cordelia Thorne, alive. It wasn't possible. He'd paid Murphy a fortune to make sure the job was done right, to make sure there were no survivors, no witnesses, no one left to contest the forged documents, the falsified claims that had allowed him to seize the Thorne Ranch. His hands shook so violently he could barely stand. If she was here, in Dust Creek, then she knew. She knew everything. She knew the railroad contract was a lie. She knew about the secret geological surveys. She knew why her husband, Samuel Thorne, really had to die. He scrambled for the telegraph key on his desk, his fingers fumbling with the brass knob. He had to get a message out. He had men on his payroll, hard men in 3 different counties, men who specialized in making problems like Cordelia Thorne disappear permanently. Down in the alley, the world had become a whirlwind of brutal, desperate motion. Cordelia drove her knee into the young deputy's ribs, feeling them snap with a sickening crack. She rolled away an instant before Kane's bullet sparked off the stone where her head had been. The deputy groaned, trying to crawl away, his panicked breaths turning to wet, ragged sobs. 5 years, Silas, she yelled, her voice echoing as she darted between the shadows of the barrels. I've had 5 years to think about you, to picture your face as you stood there, watching my home burn, watching my husband die. 5 years of listening to you tell this whole town that he was a criminal who got what he deserved. Kane fired again, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating his sweaty, terrified face. He was rustling cattle. We had evidence, he screamed back, his voice cracking. You had lies, her voice whipped back from the darkness. Lies that Dutch Hartwell paid you to believe. Lies that got my family off our land so his railroad could come through. She was toying with him now, a flicker of movement behind a water trough, a shadow darting across a moonlit patch of ground. This cat-and-mouse game was fraying his nerves, making his trigger finger jumpy. He was never good under pressure. That's why he'd always needed men like Murphy, men who enjoyed the dirty work. Where is that fat bastard anyway? Kane muttered to himself, his eyes darting back toward the alley entrance, where Murphy was slumped. The man hadn't moved. His eyes were still wide open, staring blankly at the chaos unfolding in front of him, staring in pure, silent horror. What did you do to him? Kane shouted. I gave him what he gave my husband, her voice whispered, seeming to come from right behind him. Time to think about what he'd done. Kane spun around, firing wildly into the empty darkness. Once, twice, 3 times. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded deputy and Kane's own ragged breathing. And then she stepped out of the shadows. She emerged into the moonlight, not like a person, but like an idea of vengeance made flesh. She wasn't even breathing hard. Kane fumbled at his belt for his spare ammunition, but his hands were shaking too badly. The bullets slipped through his clumsy fingers, clattering uselessly on the cobblestones. He was disarmed. He was exposed. He was cornered. She stopped about 10 feet away from him, her eyes burning holes into his soul. Now, if you were in my shoes, Sheriff, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the alley, a cold, curious edge to it. What would you do next? Would you get down on your knees and beg for mercy? Or would you try to run, hoping I'm not as fast as I look? She paused, a slight, cruel smile on her lips. I want you to think about that. In fact, if you're watching this, what would you have chosen? Tell me in the comments. Because what Sheriff Kane decided to do in that very moment would determine if he lived to see another sunrise. He chose to run. Like a coward, he turned and bolted, scrambling toward the relative safety of the main street, his heavy boots slipping and sliding on the slick, wet stones. But Cordelia didn't follow. She just watched him go, a knowing look on her face. She had planned this night for 5 years. She knew this town better than the men who ran it. She knew its secrets, its shortcuts, its hidden pathways. She knew exactly where a terrified man like Silas Kane would run. He would run to the one place he felt safe, his jailhouse, and she knew a way to get there first. What Kane didn't know, as he sprinted through the deserted streets, was that the telegram from Dutch Hartwell was already singing across the wires, a desperate plea for hired guns. Help was coming, but it wouldn't get there in time to save him. Kane burst through the door of his own office, gasping for air, his lungs on fire. He slammed the heavy oak door shut and fumbled with the bolt, his trembling hands making the simple task nearly impossible. Finally, it slid home. Safe. He was safe. He leaned against the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get a rifle. He had to barricade himself in. He turned toward the gun rack on the far wall, and then he froze. A voice, calm and quiet, drifted from the direction of the jail cells. I'm already here, Silas. He spun around, his blood running cold. There, sitting calmly in one of his own jail cells, was Cordelia Thorne. The cell door was hanging wide open. She was holding his prized Winchester rifle across her lap, handling it with an easy familiarity that made his stomach clench. How did you? He stammered, his back pressing hard against the door, as if he could melt through the wood. You were always slow, Silas, she said, standing up and stepping out of the cell. She moved with a liquid grace, the rifle never leaving his chest. Slow to think, slow to act. That's why Dutch always used Murphy for the important work. You were just the uniform, weren't you? The shiny badge that made it all look like official business. His mind reeled, the shortcut through the old livery stable. Of course, he should have remembered. But how could she know? Sweat poured down his face as the memories he'd suppressed for 5 long years came flooding back. The night Dutch had laid the railroad map out on this very desk. The gleam of gold coins stacked neatly beside it. A fortune for a small-town sheriff. The simple instructions: declare Samuel Thorne a fugitive, look the other way while Murphy handles the rest, and collect his money. It had been so easy. Dutch never told you the real story, did he? Cordelia continued, her voice a low, hypnotic murmur. She took a step closer. He never told you why Samuel really had to die. It was never just about the land, Silas. It was about what was under the land. She reached into her dress, but this time she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a worn leather document case, a case Kane recognized with a sickening jolt of dread. It was Samuel Thorne's surveying kit. It was supposed to have been destroyed in the fire. Samuel was a self-taught geologist, she said, opening the case and pulling out a sheaf of official-looking papers. She tossed them onto his desk. He found something. Something big. Kane's eyes fell upon the papers. They were geological surveys, claim filings, letters from an assayer in Denver. The words swam before his eyes, but one stood out, repeated over and over again. Copper. He'd filed a claim 3 days before you murdered him, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. A massive copper deposit, the richest vein this side of the territories. It would have made us wealthier than Dutch Hartwell could ever dream of being. Kane's knees buckled. He slid down the door, slumping to the floor. The railroad, it was all a lie, a cover story. Dutch didn't just want the right-of-way for the tracks. He wanted the mineral rights. By killing Samuel and Cordelia, by making it look like there were no heirs, he could declare the property abandoned and claim everything for himself. Impossible, Kane whispered, shaking his head. The fire, it destroyed everything. No survivors, no heirs. Because you were lazy, she spat, the first flicker of real anger breaking through her icy calm. You saw the flames, you heard Murphy's report, and you assumed your job was done. You never bothered to send men in to check for a body. My body, her finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger. I crawled out of that cellar, half dead and half burned, but I crawled out, and I was more angry than you can possibly imagine. The bolt on the front door jiggled, then a key slid into the lock. The door creaked open, pushing Kane's slumped body aside. Dutch Hartwell stepped inside, looking immaculate in his expensive suit. He was flanked by 4 men Kane had never seen before. They weren't townsfolk. They had the dead eyes and the quiet confidence of men who killed for a living. Well, well, Dutch said, a smug smile spreading across his face as he took in the scene. The dead do rise, it seems. He adjusted his silk tie, his gaze falling on Cordelia. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, my dear. But Cordelia wasn't looking at Dutch's hired guns. She wasn't even looking at Dutch. She was smiling, a genuine, terrifying smile. And that smile scared Silas Kane more than all the guns in the room. You were always too clever for your own good, Dutch, Cordelia said, her voice calm. The Winchester in her hands never wavered from Kane's chest, even with 4 pistols now aimed directly at her back. But never quite clever enough. Dutch Hartwell strolled into the jailhouse like he owned it, which in a way he did. He'd put on weight in the last 5 years, a soft paunch straining the buttons of his tailored waistcoat. He was the picture of success, a man who had built an empire on the ashes of another man's life. 5 years, Cordelia, he sighed, shaking his head with mock sadness. You could have stayed dead. It would have been so much simpler for everyone. He gestured lazily, and his 4 hired guns fanned out, their movements economical and professional. They cut off every possible escape route. The jailhouse had become a steel and stone tomb. Instead, Dutch continued, you come back here, complicating things. Complicating things? She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that made the hired guns exchange uneasy glances. Dutch, I haven't even started. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. See, while you've been getting fat and comfortable, I've been busy, very busy. With her free hand, she reached into her coat and pulled out another stack of papers, thicker this time. She tossed them onto Kane's desk. Dutch, his curiosity piqued, picked them up. As he read the first page, the color drained from his face. His smug confidence shattered like cheap glass. Railroad contracts, he breathed, his voice a strangled whisper. My contracts. How did you... It turns out, Cordelia said, her voice like honey mixed with poison, that powerful executives get very nervous when they learn one of their business partners is a murderer. Amazing what a woman can learn when she has nothing left to lose and 5 years to plan. They were especially interested to hear about the forged mineral surveys and the landowner you had killed to acquire them. Dutch's hands trembled as he shuffled through the documents. It was all there. Copies of his secret correspondence, sworn affidavits from geologists he'd bribed, a detailed timeline of the entire conspiracy, laid out in black and white. His entire empire, built on a foundation of lies, was crumbling in his hands. The Union Pacific Board pulled all of their contracts yesterday morning, Cordelia continued, her voice relentless. It seems they don't like being associated with men who burn families alive. It's bad for their reputation. All your banknotes are coming due at the end of the week, aren't they, Dutch? Without the railroad's money, you're not just broke. You're ruined. One of the hired killers, a tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek, took a menacing step forward. Boss, he growled, his hand hovering over his holstered pistol. Let's just finish this. But Dutch held up a trembling hand, silencing him. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The debts, the enemies he'd made. Without his money, he was a dead man. You think you've won? Dutch hissed, his voice cracking with desperation. Even if the railroad is gone, you're still just one woman. These men, he gestured to his killers, they don't work for the railroad. They work for me, and I pay them very, very well to solve my problems. Problems like witnesses? Cordelia asked, a strange, almost joyful light in her eyes. And something in her tone, some hidden meaning, made the hired guns shift uncomfortably on their feet. What witnesses? Dutch demanded. Cordelia's smile widened. For the first time since she'd stepped foot in Dust Creek, she looked genuinely happy. The witnesses I've been gathering for the last 5 years, Dutch, she said. The bartender from Murphy's, whose brother you had run out of town. The telegraph operator, who you underpaid to send your coded messages. The stable boy who saw you meeting with Murphy and Kane the night of the fire. The list is quite long. She nodded toward the barred window of the jailhouse. I've been leaving them little breadcrumbs all day. Copies of your letters, pages from Samuel's journal. It seems they've finally put all the pieces together. Dutch and the others turned to look. Through the window they could see them. Torches. Dozens of them, like angry fireflies, moving through the main street. And they were all heading this way. The low rumble of an angry crowd was growing louder, the sound of a town that had finally woken up. "They're coming for you, Dutch," she whispered. "All of them. Turns out good people don't like being lied to, and they really don't like finding out their town was built on a foundation of murder." The hired guns looked at Dutch, their loyalty suddenly wavering. They were paid to kill a woman in a dark alley, not fight an entire town. Dutch was trapped. His money was gone. His protectors were faltering, and an army of his own citizens was coming to tear him apart. It was over, but what none of them knew, not Cordelia, not Dutch, not the approaching mob, was that the Jimson weed was beginning to wear off. And down in the alley, Thomas Razor Murphy, his mind clear for the first time in 5 years, had just managed to crawl to the hidden shotgun he kept stashed behind a loose brick. And he was about to turn this final confrontation into an absolute bloodbath. The world exploded in a shower of glass and splintered wood. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space of the jailhouse. Everyone instinctively dove for cover as the window disintegrated. Razor Murphy, fueled by a potent cocktail of lingering poison and pure, nihilistic rage, had dragged himself to the mouth of the alley. His legs were still mostly useless, but his arms, the arms that had earned him his nickname, worked just fine. A second blast roared, and one of Dutch's hired killers screamed, clutching his chest as he was thrown backward against the wall, a gory painting of red on the drab gray stone. "Razor!" Dutch shrieked, a new frantic terror in his voice. But Murphy wasn't listening. The poison had burned away the fog of alcohol and arrogance, leaving him with one crystal-clear realization. He was a dead man. If Cordelia didn't kill him, Dutch would have him silenced to tie up the last loose end. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. Cordelia rolled behind Kane's heavy oak desk as bullets began to fly from every direction. The remaining 3 hired guns, their professionalism dissolving into panic, started shooting at anything that moved. Sheriff Kane was curled into a whimpering ball in the corner, his hands clamped over his ears. Dutch, meanwhile, had produced a small silver derringer from his waistcoat and was firing blindly in Cordelia's direction. "This is all your fault," Dutch screamed over the cacophony of gunfire. "If you had just stayed in your grave, none of this would have happened." "You're right," Cordelia's voice called back, unnervingly calm amidst the chaos. "I should have stayed dead. But Samuel, he wouldn't let me rest." She rose from behind the desk, not with one gun, but with 2. In her left hand was her own pearl-handled Colt. In her right, Sheriff Kane's service revolver, which she must have lifted off him when he was cowering. The hired guns turned their fire on her, but she was already moving, a whirlwind of black cloth and controlled violence. She dropped into a sideways roll, their bullets splintering the floorboards where she had been standing an instant before. From the doorway, Murphy fired his shotgun again. Another of Dutch's men went down, clutching his leg and screaming. But the effort of reloading left Murphy exposed. Dutch saw his chance. He steadied his aim and put 2 quick shots into Murphy's broad chest. The big man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and then slumped forward, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a final, shuddering sigh. "One down," Dutch muttered, a crazed look in his eyes. He spun back toward the desk, ready to finish Cordelia, but she was gone. The remaining 2 killers stood back to back in the center of the smoke-filled room, turning in circles, their eyes wide. Kane was still sobbing in the corner. Dutch was backing slowly toward the rear exit, his empty derringer shaking in his hand. "Where is she?" one of the killers hissed, his voice tight with fear. The answer came from directly above them. Cordelia had somehow climbed onto the cabinets and hoisted herself up into the crawl space above the office. Now she dropped through the flimsy ceiling tiles like a hawk descending on its prey. She landed squarely on the back of the nearest gunman, her weight driving him to his knees. Before he could even cry out, her knife, the same one that had killed the deputy, flashed in the lantern light and plunged deep between his shoulder blades. The last killer spun and fired, but Cordelia was already a step ahead. She used the dying man's body as a gruesome shield, the bullets thudding into his back. Then, shoving the corpse aside, she put two precise shots from Kane's revolver into the final gunman's chest. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. And then, silence. A thick, ringing silence broken only by the crackle of the torches outside and Kane's pathetic, terrified sobs. Dutch Hartwell stood alone by the back door. His expensive suit was torn, spattered with blood and covered in plaster dust. His pistol was empty. And Cordelia Thorne, a specter of death and retribution, was walking slowly toward him, her face an unreadable mask, a smoking gun in each hand. "Please," Dutch whispered, his voice barely audible. "Cordelia, please. It was just business. It wasn't personal." "Not personal?" The words were a low growl, a sound that was barely human. "You burned my husband alive for a patch of dirt. You destroyed my life for rocks in the ground. You made it personal." She raised her Colt, the hammer clicking back with terrifying finality. She was going to end it, right here, right now. But just as her finger tightened on the trigger, the front door of the jailhouse didn't just open. It exploded inward. The mob didn't enter the jailhouse. They flooded it. 24 angry faces illuminated by the flickering, hellish light of their torches. Farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, the ordinary people of Dust Creek, armed with shotguns, hunting rifles, and a righteous fury that had been simmering for 5 long years. They saw the bodies, smelled the gunpowder, and their simmering anger boiled over into a tidal wave of mob justice. Dutch Hartwell flattened himself against the back wall, his eyes wide with animal terror, as he saw the faces of the people he'd cheated and lied to for years. They surrounded him, a suffocating circle of judgment. "String him up!" a voice roared from the back. "Hang 'em both!" screamed another, pointing a trembling finger at the still cowering Sheriff Kane. But then Cordelia held up a hand, and the roaring mob somehow fell silent. She stood in the center of the carnage, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, her black dress torn and stained. She looked less like a victim and more like a battle-worn queen. "This man," she said, her voice clear and strong, pointing one of her smoking pistols at Dutch, "murdered my husband, Samuel Thorne, for money. He paid Thomas Murphy to burn our home to the ground with us inside it, so he could steal our land and the copper buried beneath it." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. They pressed closer to Dutch, their faces twisted with hate. "And this man," she continued, nodding toward the weeping sheriff, "helped him. Sheriff Silas Kane used his badge to make it all look legal. He filed false charges against my husband. He lied to all of you. He made you accomplices to his crimes." "We should have known," sobbed Mrs. Patterson, the owner of the general store. "Samuel Thorne was a good man. He never hurt a soul." The crowd roared its agreement. Their rage was a living thing in the small room, hungry for a release. Dutch and Kane were dead men. "But I'm not going to be the one to kill them," Cordelia announced. The crowd went silent again, stunned. Dutch's eyes widened, a flicker of insane hope in them. But Cordelia's smile was colder than a tombstone in winter. "I'm going to let you decide," she said, her voice dropping, drawing them in. "They didn't just steal from me. They stole from this whole town. They stole its decency. They murdered in your name. Their poison has infected all of us." She stepped back, keeping both men covered, ceding the floor to the townspeople. "So, I ask you," she said, her voice ringing off the stone walls, "what is the price for that kind of betrayal?" The town's answer was swift. It was brutal. It was unanimous. They surged forward. Dutch's scream was cut short as a dozen calloused hands grabbed him, dragging him kicking and squealing out into the night. Kane shrieked and tried to crawl away, but there was nowhere to run. The people he was sworn to protect, the people he had sold out for a bag of gold, closed in around him. Cordelia stood in the jailhouse doorway and watched as the mob dragged the two men toward the old gnarled oak tree at the edge of town, the one they used for hangings. She felt no satisfaction, no joy, no peace. The fire that had taken her husband still burned inside her, and she knew in that moment that it would never truly go out. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink, two bodies swayed gently in the morning breeze, hanging from the heavy branches of the old oak. Justice, rough and final, had been delivered by the people of Dust Creek. Cordelia walked through the now empty streets one last time. Her revenge was complete. The men who had destroyed her life were dead. The town knew the truth. But her heart was a hollow, aching void. None of it could bring Samuel back. At the train station, she bought a one-way ticket west to California. A new life. A new name. She still had the copper claim, legally filed in Samuel's name, making her his sole heir. The wealth that had driven Dutch Hartwell to murder would soon be hers. Enough money to make her a queen. But it all felt like ash in her hands. As the train chugged slowly out of the station, she pressed her face against the cool glass of the window, watching the hanging tree shrink into the distance. Samuel was avenged. The town was, for now, free of its corruption. She never set foot in Dust Creek again. But her story didn't end there. It became a legend, a whisper told around campfires across the frontier. Some said the woman in black became a bounty hunter, using her fortune to hunt down the corrupt and the cruel. Others claimed she bought a quiet ranch in a hidden valley, finally finding a small measure of the peace that had been stolen from her. But in Dust Creek, where two unmarked graves served as a permanent reminder of 5 years of lies, they never forgot the ghost who came back from the flames to set their world right. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And be sure to click on the video you see on your screen right now. It's a story with a twist so shocking, you'll be thinking about it for weeks. Click it now, you won't regret it.